Hey friends, it's Jimmy here, just kindly asking you to hit the like and subscribe buttons and the notification bell. Also, drop a comment down below and let me know where you're listening from, since this really helps me out in the algorithm. Now, with that said, let's get down to business. On a chilly December day in 2014, a teenager walking home in rural Beaver County, Pennsylvania, stumbled upon something that defied imagination. Lying in the woods, just 30 feet from a quiet country road, was a human head, and it looked almost alive. The grayish-white hair was carefully curled and styled, the skin smooth and waxy, as if the woman had just been prepared for a viewing at a funeral home. It was a macabre contrast, a body part meticulously preserved, yet carelessly discarded. Local police had never seen anything like it, and the discovery would launch one of the most bizarre unsolved cases in Pennsylvania's history. The teenage boy who found it initially thought it might be a mannequin or animal, but upon getting closer he realized the horror of his discovery and called the cops. Investigators arrived to a perplexing scene. The head of an older woman lay on its side atop the leaves, with no signs of the rest of the body nearby. Strangely, there was no blood, no insects, and no evidence of animal scavenging, nothing to indicate a typical outdoor death scene. It appeared the head hadn't been there long, perhaps only days, since fallen leaves weren't even covering it up. To police, this suggested the head was deliberately placed in that spot, rather than naturally deposited or dragged by animals. As investigators photographed the scene and collected soil and leaf samples, they noted small clues. The tip of the woman's nose appeared slightly flattened, as if it had been pressed against something. This hinted that the head might have been stored or transported in a container prior to being left in the woods. At the coroner's office, the mystery deepened. The head was in a remarkable state of preservation. A closer examination confirmed that the woman's remains had been professionally embalmed, like a typical corpse prepared by a funeral home. Her skin was rubbery to the touch. There was even evidence of makeup having been applied, and her hair was neatly manicured. These were all signs consistent with standard mortuary care. This strongly suggested that the woman likely perished of natural causes and had been through post-mortem preparations. In fact, detectives theorized that whoever was responsible had intercepted the body after death, perhaps en route from a funeral home to a cemetery. The most jarring find was discovered when the coroner lifted the woman's eyelids. Beneath each lid was a plastic eye cap, a normal mortician's tool, but the eyeballs themselves were missing. In their place sat small red rubber balls, the kind of cheap, bouncy balls one might get from a toy vending machine. This gruesome detail baffled everyone. In standard embalming practice, if eyes are removed for organ donation, the sockets are gently filled with cotton before the caps are applied. No professional had ever heard of using bright red rubber balls to replace eyes. Investigators even tracked down identical bouncy balls marked "Made in China" from local quarter machines, but they were so common that tracing their buyer proved impossible. Another crucial clue was the precise manner in which the woman's head was removed. The exterior of the neck showed jagged, rough cutting through the skin and throat, but internally, the cut was clean and surgical. The entire neck portion of the spine had been expertly removed in one piece. This meant whoever severed the head knew exactly how to separate the head from the spine at the joints, likely to keep the spine intact. These observations strongly pointed to someone with anatomical or surgical knowledge. Toxicology tests on the preserved tissues revealed traces of lidocaine and atropine, drugs commonly used in emergency cardiac care. This finding supports the theory that the Jane Doe died of a heart attack or heart failure, and that medics attempted to resuscitate her. In other words, this was more evidence that her death itself, was likely natural and occurred under medical care rather than by violence. With these intriguing clues in hand, investigators faced the formidable task of identifying the woman. This wasn't simply a missing person-based Jane Doe case. In fact, it was likely that no missing person report or any criminal report existed for her at all. If, as suspected, she died of natural causes, and her body was intended for normal burial or donation, her family probably believed she was laid to rest. They may have no idea that her head was separated and her identity lost. This made the usual avenues of identification, such as fingerprint databases and missing persons lists, essentially useless. Detectives tried to extract DNA from the remains, but the embalming process had unfortunately destroyed most viable genetic material. Even with help from some of the country's top forensic labs, what little DNA they obtained did not match any profiles in national databases. In hopes of jogging someone's memory, police turned to forensic art. Just a week after the discovery, a sketch of the Jane Doe's face was released to the public in a press conference. These images, showing an older Caucasian woman with a kind face and curly short gray hair, generated hundreds of tips over the years. In fact, police say they've investigated close to 200 leads or tips from the public, following up on any mention of a missing elderly woman or any scenario that might fit. At present, numerous women have been ruled out as the Beaver County Jane Doe. As the case stalled, investigators began focusing on a troubling theory that could explain how an embalmed head ended up in the woods. The evidence pointed toward the shadowy world of the body trade. This is a largely unregulated industry in which cadavers or body parts are bought and sold for medical research, training, or even to collectors. Unlike organ transplantation, which is tightly regulated and illegal to profit from, the trade of non-transplant body parts isn't federally overseen. Companies known as body brokers often acquire bodies and then dismember and distribute parts to universities, private labs, or training programs. Some bodies are obtained by offering the family to pay for all funeral costs, and these services deliberately target the poor and destitute. In this case, several clues lined up with that body broker scenario. First, the precise removal of the cervical spine suggested a motive to separate valuable parts. A head with the spine attached might be less useful to a buyer than a cleanly severed head and an intact spinal column sold separately. The cuts on Jane Doe's neck were so skillful that experts believed they were made to maximize the profitability of both the head and the spine as separate specimens. This isn't something a casual perpetrator would do, but according to the authorities, it's consistent with practices in the body brokerage business. Additionally, investigators considered attempting a little sting operation, purchasing a human head themselves for comparison. While the police ultimately decided against it, investigative journalists at Reuters picked up the idea. In 2017, Reuters reporters were able to buy 2 human heads from a body broker in Tennessee for about $300 each. When an anatomist compared those purchased heads to the Jane Doe's case, the similarities in the cut locations and the absence of cervical vertebrae were striking. It reinforced the theory that the Beaver County Jane Doe's head had once passed through the hands of a body broker or similar enterprise. Throughout the investigation, authorities kept an open mind to alternatives. One theory was an old-fashioned grave robbery. Perhaps someone dug up a recently buried woman and took her head. This idea faded as no reports of tampered graves or missing heads came in from any cemetery in the region. Plus, the forensic evidence of the precise cuts pointed away from a hasty grave desecration and towards something more systematic. Perhaps the darkest theory of all is that this was a much more direct foul play scenario. Under this theory, the perpetrator was a medical professional, likely a surgeon, who would have known how to dose her with medication to make it look accidental. Under this theory, the perpetrator then embalmed her head to confuse investigators. While not impossible, it's a far less likely scenario than the body trade explanation based on what is known. Investigators also looked at the scenario of a stolen cadaver from a medical institution. There have been cases of cadavers being improperly disposed of or even stolen. But again, the way Jane Doe's head was prepared didn't quite fit a typical medical school cadaver. No medical schools reported a head lost, and the evidence of makeup having been applied to the embalmed head strongly suggested against this. One perplexing aspect is why the head was left where it was. If someone was trying to hide evidence of illicit body dealing, dumping a head in a field where a passerby could find it seems counterintuitive. This has led some to speculate that maybe the perpetrator wanted it to be found, though the reasoning for this can only be speculated. Looking at the evidence, I think the most logical explanation is that the Beaver County Jane Doe came from the body broker industry. Her head was embalmed, her hair was styled, and everything was surgically done, not sloppy or violent. Those details point to someone trained in anatomy or mortuary work, not a random perpetrator. The missing cervical spine suggests her body was deliberately separated for resale, which lines up with how body brokers handle specimens for medical or educational purposes. It's a largely unregulated trade, where cadavers can move through several hands with virtually no oversight. In my view, this case was the sad byproduct of a broken system that treats the remains of the poor and destitute like inventory. Nearly 11 years have passed since that December day, and the Beaver County Jane Doe remains unidentified and her case unsolved. Somewhere out there, there's a family who buried a relative around 2014, never imagining that her head would end up miles away in an evidence locker. Thankfully, despite the fact that foul play likely wasn't a factor, the authorities are still actively investigating this case. It was a routine Sunday morning at a Bellingham, Washington pulp mill, until a worker peered into an industrial chimney and made a ghastly find. On September 20th, 1987, around 5 in the morning, Georgia Pacific Mill employee Roy Harris checked a seldom-used boiler chimney after an alarm signaled a possible leak. Looking through an open lid at the top of the steel stack, Harris saw human remains about 17 feet down. On a grid of pipes lay a partially skeletal body, severely burned by the boiler's heat. Harris alerted plant supervisors and the police. Based on the condition of the remains, officials believed the body had been in the chimney for at least several days, perhaps even weeks, before its discovery. It was clear this was no ordinary incident, as this man had died in an almost inaccessible spot. The victim was determined to be an adult male in his 30s, standing about 5'10" and likely weighing around 150 pounds in life. He was believed to be of white, Hispanic, or possibly of Native American heritage. The enclosed chimney's extreme heat had charred the remains, hindering many forensic analyses. Examiners noted the man's dental work was high quality, with multiple fillings and evidence of a root canal. Such dental care suggested he likely came from at least a middle-class background. The medical examiner found multiple broken bones consistent with a fall into the stack. The official cause of death was listed as exposure by hypothermia, suggesting the man likely died from cold before the boiler's heat scorched his body. Given the destruction of most forensic evidence, the manner of his death couldn't be identified. Disturbingly, scratch marks on the chimney's interior walls indicated a desperate but unsuccessful attempt to claw upward toward the opening. This suggested that if he jumped into the stack willingly, he later had a change of heart. Notably, the man had no identification or personal items with him. The only object found was a charred fragment of a Continental Airlines ticket. Unfortunately, it was too fragmentary to trace, revealing only a few digits and no names. This hinted the man might have recently flown to the area, but the lead ultimately went nowhere. In the end, the scene provided intriguing clues and deepened the mystery of who this man was and how he ended up there. A baffling aspect of the case was how the man entered the chimney at all. The boiler stack was hard to reach, tucked deep within the steam plant and rarely inspected. To access its top, one would have to navigate through the plant and climb onto the roof, then somehow get into the opening of the stack. A metal hatch at the base of the stack was found rusted shut and had to be pried open by police, so entry from below was virtually impossible. Investigators concluded the unknown man must have entered from the top of the chimney. The spot was so isolated that the odds of anyone stumbling upon it were nearly zero. The unusual, hard-to-reach location of the body immediately fueled speculation about what kind of incident had actually occurred. With little evidence to go on, several theories have been proposed about how this man met his fate. A leading theory is that the John Doe was a thrill-seeker who snuck into the mill after hours and accidentally fell into the chimney. Years later, a tipster reported that in 1987, a group of young urban explorers used to illicitly climb the mill's structures. On one outing, a new member of that group, reportedly from New York, vanished without a trace. Right around the same time this John Doe would have died. He may have slipped into the open chimney and become trapped. This scenario aligns with much of the evidence, even the plane ticket suggesting he traveled to Washington, but without a confirmed identity, it remains conjecture. The bizarre location led some to consider foul play. Perhaps the man was slain or incapacitated elsewhere, and someone hid his body in the chimney to conceal a crime. Investigators did consider this possibility. However, there was no direct evidence of a crime beyond a trespassing incident. Investigators view it as a theoretical but remote possibility. Another possibility is that the man's entrapment was intentional, but by his own hand. He might have been trying to hide or enter the plant on his own and gotten hopelessly stuck. It's hard to imagine someone choosing this grim hiding place to end it all, but it hasn't been ruled out. However, people who are experiencing crises generally aren't thinking rationally in the first place. The signs that he tried to climb out indicate that if he jumped in intentionally, he later thought better of it. Unfortunately, if this was the case, it was too late for him. Almost 40 years later, this case remains one of Washington's most baffling John Doe mysteries. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here. Just reminding you that you can help out my channel by clicking the join button or checking out the Patreon. The term golden years is meant to evoke a sense of peace, a well-earned reward of quiet comfort after a long life. It's a time for front porches, familiar neighbors, relaxing with family, and the safety of home. But between 1990 and 1996, in the historic West End of Richmond, Virginia, that promise was shattered. For at least 13 elderly women, their golden years became a season of unimaginable terror. Their homes transformed from sanctuaries into mortuaries. This is the story of the Golden Years slayings, and a horror which began on July 1st, 1990, when 89-year-old Mabel Venable was found cut down inside her house. It was a brutal, shocking crime that served as a dark omen of the 6-year nightmare to come. Following the slaying of Mabel Venable, a chilling and specific pattern began to emerge. Over the next 2 years, 5 more elderly women were eliminated in their homes, each attack bearing the same terrifying signature. The victims were all black women, ranging in age from 61 to 85, who lived by themselves. The list of the dead grew steadily. 80-year-old Eva Jones and 61-year-old Mary Coffey in October 1990, 61-year-old Robinette Mickleberry in May 1991, 85-year-old Pearl Gash in December 1991, and finally, 81-year-old Martha Bolden in May 1992. The method in each of these first 6 attacks was consistent and brutal. The women were stabbed. This consistent modus operandi suggested a single predator was at work, a perpetrator with a clear and horrifying preference for a specific type of victim. The community was paralyzed by a unique kind of fear that can only be evoked from violating the home. Then, as suddenly as the attacks had begun, they stopped. For 2 years, an uneasy silence settled over Richmond's West End. Residents wondered if the predator had died, been imprisoned for another crime, or simply moved on. But the monster hadn't vanished. It was merely dormant, and when it re-emerged, it would be terrifyingly different. On August 16, 1994, the uneasy peace was broken with the slaying of 59-year-old Phyllis Harris. The terror was back, but the perpetrator's signature had completely changed. The new victims, beginning with Harris, were all white women. Even more jarring was the change in method. He now preferred strangulation. After the slaying of 82-year-old Inez J. Childress in September 1994, the attacker once again went dormant for a time. Unfortunately, he would be back in 1996 to unleash a final, terrifying onslaught. 5 women were slain in just 4 months. Lucille Boyd, 75, in January, Gertrude Gardner, 77, in February, Mamie Harris Verlander, 84, in March. Then, in the most brazen set of attacks, there was Elizabeth Seibert, 69, and Jane Foster, 55, on consecutive days in April. The rapid succession of attacks sent a fresh wave of panic through the city. As the body count rose, Richmond transformed into a city under siege. The slayings provoked widespread outrage, not just because of their brutality, but because of the victims' profound vulnerability. Fear became a tangible part of daily life, especially for elderly women. Sales of weapons, door locks, and guard dogs surged as residents took security into their own hands, no longer trusting that they were safe in their own homes. In some neighborhoods, citizens' patrols were formed with police assistance, a clear sign that public faith in the authorities' ability to protect them was eroding. In 2000, 4 years after the last attack, a suspect finally emerged, but he was far from the criminal mastermind some might have imagined. Leslie Burchart was a 51-year-old homeless man with a long and documented history of severe mental illness, including a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Burchart was already in prison, serving a life sentence for confessing to the slaying of 3 homeless men in 1996. Then, in 1999, he contacted authorities and confessed to 4 of the Golden Years attacks. He admitted to having taken the lives of the last 4 victims, Lucille Boyd, Mamie Verlander, Elizabeth Seibert, and Jane Foster. His confession was stunningly detailed. He provided information about the crime scenes that was supposedly known only to investigators, making his claims seem highly credible. For a police department under immense pressure, it was the breakthrough they desperately needed. However, the confession was built on a foundation of sand. Burchart was a man known to suffer from hallucinations and hear voices. Some believe that he may have been purposely or inadvertently fed information during the confession process. Others suspect that he may have talked to someone in prison who actually committed the disturbing acts. Compounding the doubt, shortly before he died in prison from natural causes in 2002, he recanted his confession entirely and proclaimed his innocence. Due to the lack of any physical evidence connecting him to the crimes, Burchard was never formally tried, though he remains the prime and only significant suspect. With Leslie Burchard dead and no forensic evidence to provide clarity, the Golden Years slayings remain a puzzle with several competing solutions. The first theory is that a single serial perpetrator was responsible for all 13 deaths. This would require a psychological explanation for the dramatic shift in both method and victim race, a change that is highly unusual for serial predators. A second, more plausible theory suggests that Richmond was plagued by at least two separate monsters, whose crimes were mistakenly linked by police. This is the theory that I strongly prefer, because personally, I'm not seeing the strong connection to the two sets of attacks that the cops see. Under this scenario, one predator slew 6 elderly black women between 1990 and 1992 and then disappeared. 2 years later, a different attacker, perhaps Burchard, began strangling elderly white women in the same geographic area. The only common thread was the age of the victims and the fact they lived alone, which may have led to a critical case of confirmation bias by investigators. A third theory suggests that the entire investigation was essentially botched, and we can't really know what is true or what isn't. This theory stems from 2013 claims of a retired detective named Ron Reed, who worked on the case. Reed alleged that his supervisors forced him to suppress parts of Burchard's testimony, fearing that more negative publicity would destroy the department's reputation. The police department officially denied this, but did state that the other deaths Burchard allegedly confessed to were determined to have been from natural causes. For instance, Reed had tossed in the name of a woman who was known to have died of natural causes in 1996, while in a nursing home under round-the-clock care. Burchard readily provided details about how he slew the woman in her home. This allegation, if true, paints a picture of an investigation where controlling the public narrative may have taken precedence over uncovering the full truth. Decades later, the dust has never settled in Richmond. The Golden Years predator case remains officially unsolved. Leslie Burchard, the only person ever named as a suspect, will never face justice regardless, and it's unclear to what extent the cops continue to investigate the case. Whether this was one perpetrator or multiple perpetrators, the final injustice is the silence that continues to surround their deaths decades later. In the year 166 AD, a group of men claiming to be envoys from a distant Western king arrived at the court of Emperor Huan of China's Han dynasty. They had traveled by sea, landing in the southern province of Renan, modern-day Vietnam, before being escorted to the capital, Luoyang. Their king, they said, was named Andun, a name Chinese historians recognized as a plausible transliteration of Antoninus. This almost certainly referred to Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, the philosopher-emperor of Rome. This single, strange encounter, documented only in Chinese records and debated by historians ever since, is the perfect entry point into one of history's most fascinating non-relationships. It encapsulates the entire story of Han China and Imperial Rome, two colossal empires. They were the twin anchors of ancient Eurasia, aware of each other's existence but separated by such vast gulfs of distance, culture, and competing powers. At their height in the 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty were remarkably similar in scale and structure. Both were vast, multi-ethnic states controlling immense territories and populations, building extensive road networks, and fielding powerful armies to deal with frontier barbarians. They were the two poles of the civilized world as they knew it, the endpoints of a sprawling network of exchange that snaked across the continent. Yet for all their parallel might, the modern historical consensus is clear. Their relationship was almost exclusively indirect. There were no treaties, no conflicts, and no sustained diplomatic contact. Instead, their story is one of mediated exchange, where goods, ideas, and perceptions were filtered through a long chain of intermediary cultures. In the absence of firm knowledge, each empire constructed a version of the other that served its own cultural and political narratives. Through this, they created a relationship built less on reality and more on mutual myth-making. The popular image of a single Silk Road is a convenient fiction. In reality, the connection was a complex and branching network of caravan trails and maritime routes. The overland journey wasn't a single trip, but a relay trade, where goods changed hands many times in the bustling oasis cities of Central Asia, like Samarkand and Bukhara. A merchant leaving the Han capital of Chang'an would likely travel only as far as the Tarim Basin, selling his goods to a Sogdian trader. That trader might carry them to the Kushan Empire in modern Afghanistan and Central Asia, who in turn would trade with the Parthians in Persia. This system ensured that goods arrived at their final destination stripped of their original context, and information arrived as fragmented accounts. The 5,000 miles separating the capitals were a landscape of extreme peril, from the treacherous mountain passes of the Pamirs to the vast, unforgiving Taklamakan Desert. While the overland routes are more famous, a crucial maritime alternative existed. Roman sailors, having learned to harness the monsoon winds, established a lively sea trade connecting Roman Egypt with the ports as far away as Sri Lanka. From there, goods could continue on to Southeast Asia and the southern Chinese port of Guangzhou. The discovery of a Roman glass bowl in a Guangzhou tomb dating to the early 1st century BC provides concrete proof of this sea route's ancient importance. The lack of direct contact wasn't just a result of distance, but an active outcome of geopolitical strategy, primarily orchestrated by the Parthian Empire. Geographically positioned between the two superpowers, the Parthians, along with the Kushans, controlled the most critical junctures of the Silk Road. They fully understood that their immense wealth depended on their monopoly as intermediaries. They were gatekeepers who actively worked to prevent direct contact between their two biggest customers. Chinese sources are explicit on this point, noting that Parthia was often a difficulty, but that they couldn't do much about it. The most potent example of this strategy is the story of the Chinese envoy Gan Ying in 97 AD. Sent by the great Han general Ban Chao on a mission to finally establish contact with Rome, Gan Ying made it as far as Mesopotamia, on the shores of the Persian Gulf. He was on the cusp of entering Roman territory. But there, Parthian sailors, eager to protect their lucrative position, deliberately misled him. They spun tales of a perilous sea voyage that could take up to 2 years with unfavorable winds, a journey so long and disheartening that many men died of homesickness. Discouraged, Gan Ying turned back, unaware that he was likely just a few weeks' overland journey from the Roman frontier in Syria. This single masterful act of disinformation successfully thwarted China's most serious attempt to reach Rome. The trade that flowed across this fragmented network wasn't in necessities, but in highly specialized luxury goods that one empire excelled at producing. For Rome, the ultimate prize was silk. The translucent, shimmering fabric became a sensation, a symbol of wealth and status so potent that it sparked a moral panic. Conservative writers like Seneca the Younger railed against silk garments, which were often rewoven to be sheer, as symbols of decadence and effeminacy. To these writers, the silk fabrics would have disgusted the rugged men of the Republican era, like Cincinnatus or Scipio Africanus. Officials, on the other hand, worried about the massive outflow of Roman wealth to pay for it, creating a severe trade deficit. For the Han elite, the most coveted Roman products were high-quality glassware from the workshops of Alexandria and Syria. Far superior to anything produced locally, these items became powerful status symbols. Archaeologists have unearthed Roman glass bowls, beads, and gilded silver plates in the tombs of Han princes and nobles, providing the physical footprints of this long-distance exchange. This trade reveals a fascinating truth. The two empires were technological equals in different domains. In the absence of direct contact, each empire constructed a fantastical image of the other, revealing more about themselves than their distant counterparts. Roman knowledge was hazy at best. Authors like Pliny the Elder described what he called the Silk People in vague, often mythical terms. They were portrayed as a peaceful, just, and civilized people who lived to a great age and shunned direct contact with outsiders. In his telling, these Silk People were willing to leave their goods for trade in a desert spot, which clearly speaks to the reality of the handover on the Chinese frontier. Pliny's famous misconception that silk was a fleecy product combed from the leaves of trees perfectly illustrates the profound lack of first-hand knowledge. The fact that silk was produced from worms at all may have shocked the Romans. Chinese accounts primarily are more detailed but equally idealized. They called the Roman Empire Dakin, suggesting they saw Rome as a civilized counterpart to their own empire. In the mind of the Chinese elite, it was a kind of mirror image China at the other end of the world. They claimed that the people from this land were tall and honest, and also looked exactly like Chinese people. Some believe that it may have been implicit to the ancient Chinese that the Romans were some sort of ancient Chinese lost colony. However, there's no proof of this. Most strikingly, Rome was described as having a utopian political system where rulers were not hereditary, but chosen for their merit. If the kingdom suffered from calamities, the king was unceremoniously deposed and would accept his demotion without anger. Notably, while some have viewed this as a description of the system of consuls, most historians don't believe this to be the case. Instead, it's thought that this was a perfect projection of idealized Confucian values onto a distant, unknown land. In a Confucian system, if a ruler loses the mandate of heaven, the worst thing he can do is fight against it. It's like swimming against a riptide. The Romans, being distant and powerful, could serve as a model for how the Chinese believed they themselves should ideally behave. The stable political conditions that sustained even this indirect connection began to unravel in the 3rd century AD. The Han dynasty collapsed into a long period of conflict very famously known as the Three Kingdoms period. The Roman Empire entered its own protracted crisis, eventually leading to its fragmentation. The collapse of these two imperial anchors made the long-distance trade routes far more dangerous and less profitable. While trade never ceased entirely, the grand scale of exchange seen at the height of the two empires diminished significantly. The thread connecting the two ends of Eurasia had frayed, and a meaningful attempt to restart relations wouldn't start again until the 7th century. However, by that time, the Roman Empire only persisted in the east, and China was under the rule of the powerful Tang dynasty.